Space, the great beyond, the endless expanse that's inspired us, our forefathers and our ancestors. For the longest time, there wasn't much you could do about that curiosity aside from just look up, or maybe grab a telescope and imagine. But now, we live in an age where our imaginations aren't needed anymore. I don't need to think really hard to picture what mysteries the universe holds. Not because AI can make a bad render of it, but because people far smarter than me have created video games that can show me that instead.
You probably think I'm talking about Starfield, how Bethesda's new offering will break new ground and take us where we've never been before. But gamers have been floating around our galaxy and beyond for decades. Starfield is the next step, the evolution of a type of game that has always been about pushing things further than audiences thought possible. Let's talk about space. Let's talk about games, and let's talk about how Starfield is building on the legacy of some of the most ambitious and technically marvelous games ever made. So I'm talking about games set in space, and that's a pretty broad net. That could encompass things from Space Invaders to Dawn of War to Mass Effect. The titles I want to talk about aren't as much about space as they are about freedom, having the universe as your sandbox. You're the captain, commander, and cartographer of your own vessel. You choose where you go, what you do, and how you leave your mark. This isn't an open world, but open everything. And yeah, again, it sounds like I'm signaling a Starfield again, but this whole concept of an open, player-first, open simulation really kicked off way back in the 80s. So this was the time when people were getting really swept up in the sci-fi craze. 2001, A Space Odyssey wowed moviegoers in '68, and a decade later, Star Wars came along and knocked everyone's socks off. Star Trek had cemented itself as the top dog in the TV world, and it wouldn't be long before it set off on a new unknown, the budding new medium of video games. '71 saw the arrival of the first Star Trek game, but it was text-based. If players wanted something a bit more immersive, they'd have to wait a few more years. 1974 saw the release of Space Sim and Star Trader. The former set the groundwork for future flight sims, and the latter was built around a sandbox galaxy, albeit a very small one. But these were all very rooted in the time. It wasn't until a few years later that something would come along that just felt advanced. Something that shouldn't have been able to run on the hardware of the time, but somehow did. 1979's Star Raiders, no, that's Space Invaders. This is Star Raiders, both released in '79, mind you, and would you look at that difference? Anyway, what started out as a bit of tinkering by sole developer Doug Neubauer turned out to be one of the most important games of the decade, and would start the wheels turning for games we still see today. A lot of the game's development essentially followed a basic loop. Think of a feature, try to write and implement said feature, wonder why the feature doesn't work, try and fix it. Neubauer added a lot of pretty advanced stuff to the game. A first-person view that mimics 3D space, an entire galaxy map of a space sector, star bases to interact with, intense dogfights. Granted, a lot of it didn't fully work. You couldn't have more than 2 enemies on a screen at a time, and the game would slow down when an explosion went off. But the fact remains, this was light years ahead of other games of the time, and it quickly became a killer app for Atari's 8-bit system line. A truly immersive space sim had entered the public consciousness, but it would soon be succeeded by something even more ambitious. Cue Elite. Where Star Raider tested the water, Elite dove right in. Sure, it's dated now, but back then, this was a technical marvel. One of the first games to use wireframe 3D graphics, it stood out visually from all of its competitors. But as impressive as its graphics were, they weren't the main draw. The game was unlike anything that had been seen before, and made its predecessor Star Raiders, one of the hottest games of its time, feel basic. Games of this era were focused on keeping players on the tracks and doing things in a specific order and a specific way. Find this key to unlock this door to fight this boss. Elite removed these tracks and fired players into the abyss to find their own way. The base concept was to explore, get credits, upgrade your ship, and make your mark on the galaxy. But you could do it in a way of how you wanted. You could work for the military, run trade missions, mine asteroids, or become a bounty hunter. Likewise, you could take a more nefarious route. Piracy is a very realistic career route, if that was what you were after. The game featured over 250 planets, with orbiting moons and space stations. They used procedural generation to create something far greater in scope that could ever have been achieved by a developer of the time. It was a masterpiece. So publishers were jumping at the chance to distribute it, right? Well, no. The first company they got in contact with shooed it away. It was too complicated. If it couldn't be completed in 10 minutes with 3 lives, what was the point? Furthermore, the game requires players to plot hyperspace jumps, manage their fuel and resources, even do some maths here and there, heaven forbid. But eventually, the game creators found a publisher willing to take a chance on this outrageous title, Acornsoft, and boy were they rewarded, big time. Elite was a massive critical and commercial success. Its technical breakthroughs even shocked the creators of the computer it was built for, with one of the developers calling it the game that couldn't be written. But it had been. It seemed ahead of its time, an anomaly, but here it was. And it instilled in gamers all across the globe a sense of adventure and a hunger for galactic travel that would only continue to grow over the years. Elite's success gave it the green light to go from being a one-off to a franchise, and each installment got more complex and more ambitious. The third game made use of Newtonian physics, generated realistic star systems, and allowed free-form planetary landings, the kind of thing Starfield boasted about in 2023. This was 30 years ago. Other developers threw their hat in the ring to try their own takes. At the start of the 90s, players were treated by Wing Commander. Now this was a huge upgrade in graphics, and instead of focusing on being completely open-ended, tried to get players back on the narrative tracks. It had a story, branching options, and a whole boatload of lore. They even nabbed Mark Hamill to play one of the roles in the third game.
I'll fly with him. He's the best wingman I've ever had.
Wing Commander scaled down the scope of Elite and refined it, and it proved a success. The game's own creator went on to Starlancer and its sequel, Freelancer, in the same vein, as well as a more recent game that I'll get on later, if I have the time. This new formula felt cleaner and simpler. It had more mass market appeal, so games stopped imitating Elite and started imitating Wing Commander. We got a series of Star Wars games that were a perfect match for the flight sim focus. X-Wing, TIE Fighter, X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, etc. On paper, these games weren't as expansive or providing as much player freedom as Elite, but they kept the immersion up. Free Space, for instance, provided a galaxy populated with stars, planets, and nebulae, which could dilate time for the player. You'd encounter huge ships which would dwarf your humble little fighter vessel. There was even a multiplayer mode, all impressive stuff for a game from the 90s. There were still games that followed Elite's formula more closely, like X for instance, but they weren't pushing things as far as the old dogs had done back in the day. They were in the safety zone and refining rather than innovating. No one was doing anything mad or unheard of. But then something came along that was utterly unhinged. Bonkers. It was unlike anything before or after, or even today. It's an anomaly. Eve. When I say mad, I mean that in the best of ways. The same way Elite was mad, the same way Starfield is mad. These are developers seeing what's possible, what's conventional, what's popular, and saying, nope. It's how you get these one-of-a-kind games. See, Eve is an MMO, but players don't just have a world to play with. They have a universe of over 5,000 star systems, as well as many more randomly accessible systems you'll find if you're brave enough to take a little swoop through a wormhole. Eve gave the player a sandbox and set them on their way. No reminders of what you're supposed to be doing, no instructions, no tracks they want to keep you on. This is your playground. Do whatever you want. And that's what players did. It evolved into a living, breathing entity. It had an in-game economy as complicated as small countries. It spawned coalitions that carved out vast swaths of the galaxy and facilitated stories that no other game had ever managed. Clashes have gone down in the game that involved thousands upon thousands of players and their starships. One particularly destructive one earned a game world record. During a massacre at M2XFE, nearly 400,000 US worth of ships and equipment were destroyed. This is years before people were losing their minds and investing in NFTs and talking about digital currencies as the future. They had them in Eve, and they blew them up just for the hell of it. But that's what makes a game in this vein stand out. The fact that it's just a bit insane. You have the ability to think of some ludicrous plan that you can enact, and then just do it. I'd say Eve was the height of that, and in the years that followed, things got tamer. This was by no means a mainstream draw. There's lots to be impressed with, but there's also a lot to be intimidated by. The thought of having hard-earned ships worth thousands of dollars be obliterated in one fatal bloodbath, well, that's kind of a turn-off for a large chunk of players. It had the ambition and the insanity, but it didn't have that universal switch that appeals to many of us. For most, it was more daunting than it was exciting. More space sim games would follow over the years, each doing their own thing, but none really had that magic that Elite or Star Raiders had. But a decade after Eve came along, a few titles came along that would scratch that itch. The first being the obvious one, Elite Dangerous, a successor to the OG game that featured the essence of the original and brought it gloriously into the 21st century. Now this was excellent, and it had what made the original special. You were in charge, you did what you wanted, how you wanted, when you wanted. You made your name in a multitude of different ways, and while it stayed safe with the formula, it did make advancements in other ways. While it makes sense on paper to refer to this game as this generation's elite, it just isn't. It just doesn't feel like it's breaking ground or boggling my mind. That's not to say the game isn't massively impressive. The game's universe, for instance, is a one-to-one scale simulation of our own galaxy. That's 400 billion different star systems. Yes, they used a lot of tricks with procedural generation to achieve this, but there are still 150,000 systems which have been produced with real astronomical data. It's pretty spectacular and honestly quite baffling. But these were petty numbers compared to the game that would come along a few years later and boast 18 quintillion planets to discover. Of course, it's No Man's Sky. And those numbers are extraordinary. That's 18 zeros. That's too many zeros for our little heads to really wrap our heads around. This was mad. This was the same lunacy as Elite and Eve. If all things that were promised ended up being delivered, this was to be the most ambitious and extraordinary game ever made. But we all know how that goes, and it wasn't. They had oversold and underdelivered. Compare that to Elite, which was struggling to even find a publisher. It didn't promise that it was going to be a revolutionary game, it just came along and was. Sure, No Man's Sky got there eventually, but the games in this genre that really turn heads are the ones that were a revelation right out of the gate. And that's what may be the big crux of these types of games. In the past, they pushed boundaries, and they were these big surprises. They'd be built up on word of mouth and slowly amass followings. These days, hype is everything for selling games. You can't just quietly break the rules and do something mad and let the players discover it. You have to scream it from the rooftops and drum up a frenzy. And when you're telling the player all the things that they can do, that kind of takes away from the player agency that makes these games special. But then there's Starfield. See, No Man's Sky fell down wildly and spectacularly when it couldn't deliver this revolutionary game it promised. And we all thought, well, they couldn't pull off something so ambitious because it's unfeasible. But it's not that. The developer was a small indie studio. They were never going to be able to pull off what they promised. They needed a huge team, needed limitless resources, money to burn, and a long development time away from public scrutiny. All things that Bethesda has. Yes, we've been drip-fed information and our interest has been drummed up through a press conference here and there, but it's a minor pattering compared to the vast torrent of feature showcasing that was a part of the No Man's Sky press cycle. And I think that's only a good thing. Bethesda gave us a rough idea of what they had planned for us, but left a lot quite ambiguous. These games are all about player agency and freedom of choice and the thrill of discovery, so this is the right move. They don't need to show off every little detail to shift copies of their game. Because they're Bethesda, they could release it without a single mention and it would still make bank, because that name on the game sells. But this isn't about how popular a game is or how many copies it sells, it's about living up to the boldness of the trailblazers that started out in this genre decades ago. So I ask this. Will Starfield have the same impact as Elite? I'm going to answer that, but first I want to say this. I firmly believe that this has the potential to carry on Elite's legacy of being bold, brash, and a little bit mad. Yes, it will be firmly rooted in Bethesda's style, but the fact that it isn't trying to imitate and instead doing its own thing is good. Elite Dangerous was a really bold game, but it felt safe. I just hope that Starfield proves to be anything but. One trouble with this genre of games is that balance between giving the players a massive sandbox of near infinite possibilities, but also appealing to the masses. Elite Dangerous has that depth, but it's not for everyone. No Man's Sky has the wide appeal, but as it turns out, it didn't have the depth. As for Star Citizen, it has... No, I really don't have time to get into Star Citizen. I need to wrap this up. The point is, we know Starfield has a huge potential audience. Bethesda is a huge name and they carry a lot of weight with their games. It's almost certain that the game will achieve mainstream success, but if we can do this without sacrificing the depth and the experience that a space sim can offer, well then yes, we can say yes, this has the potential to be this generation's Elite, which should be a deeply exciting prospect for us all.